I want to say the whole thing started with the divorce, because that is the part people understand fastest. But the truth is, it started 8 months earlier, in a break room in Duluth where a layoff list had my name fourth from the top. I was 41 years old, and I had never in my life gone without a job. And I remember reading my own name over and over, as if it might somehow change if I stared at it long enough. Though of course it never once did. Renee and I had been married 16 years by the time she left, long enough that most of what we built together happened quietly in the background of ordinary days, in a way that made it hard to name any single thing that broke it. I do not blame her for leaving a man who had gone from steady to unemployed to, by the end of it, genuinely difficult to be in a room with. Though I have not always managed to stop blaming myself for that too. We never had children, which people sometimes assume made the divorce simpler, and which I can tell you plainly did not. And what it did instead was leave me, once the papers were signed and her sister's minivan pulled away for good, without a single person whose day would go worse if mine did. I understood that fact about myself with unusual clarity that autumn, sitting alone most evenings in an apartment still full of boxes I had not unpacked, because unpacking them felt like agreeing to stay in that life longer than I wanted to. I am telling you this, not because I think it is interesting, but so you understand exactly what kind of man reads a card pinned to a hardware store corkboard in late September and does not ask enough questions before saying yes. The card was thumbtacked between a flyer for a lost cat and an ad for firewood, handwritten in blue ink that had started to fade, and it announced that the Jernigan Family Trust needed a winter caretaker for a private lodge in the Superior National Forest. 7 months, October through April, $22,000 for the season, paid in 2 installments, with housing and a truck provided, and beneath the phone number someone had added, almost as an afterthought, that an immediate star was preferred. I called that same afternoon from the hardware store parking lot, sitting my truck with the engine off to save gas, and a clipped formal voice answered on the second ring and introduced himself as Warren Tolliver, an attorney representing the estate. He asked me 3 questions before anything else: whether I had family who would need to visit during the winter months, whether I had any medical condition requiring regular treatment, and whether I understood the position meant long stretches without cellular service or road access. I told him I had no family who would come looking, which was true, and which I said without much thought for how strange a thing that was to volunteer to a total stranger on a first phone call about a job. He told me the position was mine if I still wanted it once we had met face to face. And I drove the 4 hours north to Loon Narrows 2 days later to find out exactly what I had already halfway agreed to. Tolliver's office sat above a defunct dry goods store on the town's single commercial block, and he turned out to be a narrow, precise man in his 60s who did not offer coffee and did not make small talk of any kind. He had me sign 11 pages of contract before he told me anything real about the property itself. And only then did he explain that Cutfoot Lodge stood on the shore of a private lake called Black Kettle. It had been built in 1926, and it sat 62 miles north of town on a road the county stopped maintaining every November, once the snow got heavy enough to bury it under real drifts of white. My duties were simple on paper: keeping the pipes from freezing, running the generator, plowing the 2 miles of private drive after any heavy snowfall, and discouraging trespassers from acreage the trust owned outright around the lodge itself. A man named Gunderson would bring supplies every 2 weeks by snowmobile once the plow road became impassable to trucks, and I was to radio into town twice weekly on a fixed schedule using a base station kept in the lodge office. When I asked why the previous caretaker, a man named Earl Kessler, had left so abruptly in September, forfeiting the second half of his season's pay, Tolliver looked at me for a long moment before answering. He said only that Mr. Kessler had found the isolation harder than expected, and that the trust would appreciate it if I did not spend too much time dwelling on the particulars of another man's private departure. I did not dwell on it, because $22,000 against a checking account holding barely $1,100 did not leave much room in my head that autumn for dwelling on anything else at all. I remember the drive up the private road in more detail than I probably should, the way the county road narrowed and roughened until it gave way at a leaning gate marked Cutfoot Lodge private property, to 2 ruts of gravel running arrow straight through a corridor of pine. The trees grew so tall and so close together that the afternoon light dropped by half the moment I passed beneath them, and it took the better part of 20 minutes to cover those 2 miles even in October before the snow made the drive harder still. I remember pulling up at last into the clearing where the lodge stood with the lake spread out silver and flat behind it, and thinking, in that first hour, that I had never in my life felt so completely far from another human being. And the feeling was closer to relief than to fear. A young locksmith from a neighboring county met me there with the keys, arranged through Tolliver's office, and he did not linger long once the doors stood open, telling me, as he climbed back into his truck, that he would not spend a night this far off the grid for any money the trust was offering. I spent that first evening walking the lodge room by room with a flashlight, cataloging what needed doing. The water heater that needed bleeding, the chimney that wanted a fresh screen, and a half-stocked pantry Earl Kessler had left behind. I slept better that first night than I had in months, and I woke to loon calls out on the lake and thought, foolishly, that I had finally caught the kind of break a man in my situation had stopped expecting to get. The first 3 weeks were close to peaceful, if you can call that kind of silence peaceful. And I think the reason it felt peaceful was that I did not yet know what silence in that stretch of forest was supposed to sound like. I did not yet know, in other words, what was missing from it. And I spent those weeks doing exactly what I had been hired to do. Splitting wood, running the generator through its paces, and clearing deadfall from the 2-mile drive with a chainsaw. In the evenings, I sat on the porch with a beer from the case I had brought north with me, watching loons cross the black water and telling myself that this was, against every odd my life had handed me lately, a genuinely good thing that had happened to me. It was somewhere around the 3rd week of October that the missing part of that silence finally became noticeable, and that was the week I found the first set of tracks, half frozen into mud along the shoreline where I had gone to check the water intake screen. The print was shaped roughly like a bare human foot, but it ran closer to 18 inches from heel to the tip of the longest toe, and the stride between it and the next one, 30-some feet of the shore, was nearer 9 feet than anything a man or a moose could manage. I told myself it was a bare print distorted by mud thawing and refreezing, and I want to be fair to myself and admit that at the time I mostly believed it. Because bears do strange things to mud when the weather cannot decide what season it wants to be. I did not walk that shoreline again after dark for the rest of that week, and if I am honest with myself, I did not examine too closely why I had made that particular decision entirely on my own that day. The deer came next, and they were harder to explain away than a footprint in soft mud, and I want to describe the arrangement carefully, because it stayed with me longer than almost anything else that happened out there. I found the first one on a Tuesday morning stacked against the side of the woodshed, opened from throat to tail in what looked like a single motion, gutted clean, its bones pulled entirely free of the carcass and stacked beside it in a column. The bones ran longest at the bottom and smallest at the top, the way a child might stack blocks, if that child had a very precise and very patient understanding of anatomy, and there was almost no blood on the ground beneath it at all. I buried what was left of that deer 40 yards into the tree line with a shovel from the machine shed, and 2 days later I found a second one in nearly the same spot, arranged exactly the same way, bones stacked with the same patient precision. I stopped burying them after that and started dragging the carcasses out onto the lake ice instead, which had not yet formed thick enough to hold real weight, so that each one simply sank beneath the surface within a day or two. I told myself a pack of wolves had denned somewhere nearby, and that I was watching wolf behavior. I did not have a proper frame of reference for, and I called Gunderson on his next delivery to ask whether the Forest Service had documented wolves this deep into the Black Kettle drainage. Gunderson, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a beard gone entirely white, got very quiet at the question and told me that wolves did not stack bones, before changing the subject to whether I needed more propane before the roads closed for good. I had brought a dog with me to the lodge, a hound mix named Duke that I had gotten from a shelter in Duluth 2 years earlier, and Duke was, until the last week of October, the best company a man in my situation could ask for. He slept at the foot of my bed in the caretaker's cabin and followed me on my chores and generally acted like a dog who had won some kind of lottery, acres of forest and no leash laws to speak of anywhere on the property. Somewhere around the 25th of October, though, Duke changed, and he stopped wanting to go past the tree line on the north side of the property, the side that faced deeper into the national forest rather than toward the lake itself. When I tried to walk him in that direction, he would plant his feet and growl low in his chest at nothing I could see or hear, hackles up along his whole spine, and eventually I simply stopped forcing him to go anywhere near it. At night he took to sitting by the cabin door instead of sleeping, ears up, and more than once I woke at 2 or 3 in the morning to find him standing rigid in the dark, staring at the window, making no sound at all, which was somehow worse than if he had been barking his head off. Around that same time the ravens started, and I want to describe them separately because they never quite stopped for the rest of my time at Cutfoot Lodge, an accumulating presence rather than a single passing event. They came first in 2s and 3s, settling into the bare crowns of birches along the north tree line at dusk, and within 2 weeks, there were 40 or 50 of them up there, most evenings, silent in a way ravens are almost never silent in my experience of them. Once, carrying an armload of splits back from the woodshed, I caught in the last gray light a shape at the edge of the trees that I told myself for a long time afterward must have been a dead pine leaning at a strange angle, tall and pale where the bark should have been dark. I did not go closer to look, and I went inside instead, bolting the door 2 full hours before dark for the first time since I had arrived, while the ravens above the woodshed did not move from their branches the entire time I watched them. It was the first week of November when I heard my name called for the first time, and I want to be precise about the conditions because I have turned this over in my mind more times than I can count looking for an innocent explanation. It was a clear, cold night with no wind to speak of, and I was in the cabin reading by lantern light with Duke rigid by the door as had become his habit, when I heard from somewhere past the woodshed a voice call my name. Not Cole, which is what most people who know me casually call me, but Cole Andrew, my full first and middle name together, a name almost nobody says except my mother, who has been dead 6 years, and Renee, on the rare occasions she used it to signal I was in some kind of trouble with her. The voice was distant and thin, carried strangely on air that had no wind in it at all. And it did not sound exactly like Renee, but it sounded close enough that some old married part of my brain got halfway to the door before the rest of me caught up and stopped my hand on the latch. Duke was pressed flat against the floorboards, making a sound I had never heard a dog make before. Somewhere between a whine and a low growl, continuous and steady. And I stood there with my hand on that latch for what felt like a very long time. I made myself walk away from the door eventually and get back into bed with the lantern still burning against the dark, though sleep never once came that night, no matter how exhausted I already was by then. In the morning, in the flat gray light that makes nighttime fears look foolish, I told myself it had been an owl or the wind moving through some strange configuration of trees I had not noticed before. I have read since then, in places I will get to later on, that this is one of the things it does, taking fragments of voices it has heard over the years, voices of people who matter to you, and stitching them carefully together. It reassembles those fragments into something close enough to fool the part of your mind that wants, more than it ever wants, safety, to believe the people you love most are still out there calling for you somewhere. I did not know that yet, and what I knew was that 2 nights later I heard it again, my full name, Cole Andrew, and this time it seemed to come from closer, from somewhere near the edge of the porch itself, close enough that Duke did not growl at all this time. He simply disappeared under the bed and stayed there until well past sunrise. And I understood on some level below language that whatever fear had gripped my dog was not fear of an ordinary intruder in any ordinary sense of that word. I tried the base station radio that week outside of my scheduled check-in times, working the dial slowly through the emergency and weather channels, looking hard for anyone at all to talk to in the dark. Somewhere around midnight, on a night I could not have slept through anyway, I finally picked up a voice, faint and full of static. An older man running some kind of hobbyist relay station well south of me. I did not tell him about the voice calling my name, because even alone in a cabin 60-some miles from another living soul, I was still not yet ready to say those particular words out loud to a total stranger. But I asked him carefully whether he knew of anything unusual about the Black Kettle Lake area that a newcomer to that country ought to know before the real winter finally set in for good that season. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I thought I had lost the signal entirely. And then he said, in a voice gone flatter and more careful than it had been a moment before, that I should keep my windows shuttered after dark that time of year. He said that if I ever heard something outside calling my name, the single most important thing I could do was not answer it, not out loud and not even by opening a door to look, because a few people up that way had learned the hard way that it only needs you to answer once. I asked him what he meant by that, and the signal broke apart into static and did not return no matter how long I sat working the dial. And I never raised that station again on any night after, though I tried many times in the weeks that followed. Gunderson came through on his scheduled delivery in the second week of November, arriving by snowmobile now that the plow road had gone from difficult to impossible for a truck, hauling a sled loaded with propane and dry goods and mail addressed only to occupant. He was a talkative man under ordinary circumstances, the kind who would stand in the cold telling you about his grandchildren for 20 minutes before remembering he had somewhere to be, but that day he seemed eager to unload the sled and go. When I asked him directly whether he knew why Earl Kessler had quit the caretaker job so suddenly, back in September, his whole weathered face closed down around the eyes in a way I did not care for at all. He told me that folks around Lou Narrows generally did not talk much about what happened past Widow Creek, which he explained was the boundary locals used informally for the stretch of forest running from Black Kettle Lake north toward the border itself. I asked what was past Widow Creek that made people so quiet about it, and he looked at me the way you look at someone you feel sorry for, and told me I ought to talk to Ruth Ann Sorensen at the Historical Society in town. He said he did not have the stomach for it himself, standing out here with the light already going gray at 3 in the afternoon, and I pressed him a little further before he climbed back onto the snowmobile. He stopped with one hand on the throttle and told me in a lower voice than he had used all day that his own grandfather had worked timber in that country decades after the Jernigan camp closed, and had passed down one strict rule to the whole family. If the woods ever went quiet all at once, no birds, no wind moving the treetops, you did not wait around to find out why. You turned and walked out the way you came, calm and steady, and you never once looked back over your shoulder, no matter what you thought you heard behind you. He told me that his grandfather had never once explained what he was supposed to be listening for when the woods went quiet like that, only that he had heard it happen exactly twice in his whole life. His grandfather had walked out both times without ever once looking back over his shoulder, and had died at the age of 86, still refusing to say another word about it, even to his own family. Even at the very end, Gunderson would not meet my eyes for the rest of that conversation. And when I asked whether he believed his own grandfather's story, he only shrugged and said he had delivered supplies out here for going on 9 years now. 4 different caretakers in that time, he said, and he had learned not to need an answer to that particular question in order to keep doing his job carefully. And then he got back on his snowmobile and left faster than the roads really allowed. I drove the plow truck into Lou Narrows 2 days later on one of my scheduled radio check-in days, using the excuse of picking up a generator part that Gunderson had not been able to fit onto his sled. I went first to the county library, which shared a building with the Historical Society in a converted church on the edge of town, and I asked the woman at the desk whether she knew anything about the history of Cudfoot Lodge. Ruth Ann Sorensen turned out to be a woman in her 70s with sharp eyes and a cardigan that looked hand-knitted, and when I told her I was the new caretaker, she gave me a long look before speaking. She said I was the 4th caretaker in 11 years to come ask her that exact question, and that the previous 3 had all stopped asking her anything at all within a single season of starting the job. She led me back to a small room with a microfilm reader and 2 locked filing cabinets, and pulled out, without much searching at all, a folder that seemed already kept ready for men who came asking like me. It was thick with photocopies and yellowed clippings, and she set it down on the table in front of me and told me to take my time, though her tone made clear she was hoping I would not have too many questions. The oldest clipping in that folder came from a Duluth newspaper dated the 2nd week of February in 1902, describing the disappearance of an entire logging crew from a camp called Jernigan Camp No. 4. The camp had stood on the shore of what the article called Kettle Lake, on land owned by the timber concern of Ezra Jernigan, and the crew had numbered 32 men according to the camp's own records that winter. When a supply team finally arrived in late January after being cut off for 3 full weeks by blizzard conditions, they found the camp abandoned, cookhouse fires cold, and no bodies anywhere in sight. There was no clear sign of struggle beyond overturned bunks, and the article noted, with a specificity that struck me even reading it more than a century later, bones stacked in orderly piles behind several of the camp structures. The only survivor found alive was the camp foreman himself. Ezra Jornigan, discovered 3 miles from camp in a snow cave he had dug and lived inside through part of the blizzard, in a state of violent and ravenous madness. It took 4 grown men to subdue him before he could be moved anywhere near civilization at all, and the article gave no further detail on what exactly had happened to provoke that particular condition in him. A follow-up clipping from that same spring reported that Jernigan had been committed to a state asylum near Fergus Falls, where he reportedly continued insisting to any doctor willing to listen that something had come into the camp during the blizzard. He called it only the Hungry One and claimed it had worn the faces of the men it took before it took them, calling out in their own voices to lure the others from shelter one by one, night after night, until almost nobody was left. Doctors at the time attributed his account to a combination of starvation, exposure, and what one physician's notes, quoted in a later retrospective article, called a probable psychotic break brought on by extreme privation and grief. That same retrospective article, written decades later, noted that similar conditions had been documented among other trappers and loggers who endured extended winter isolation. Though it never used the specific term, the doctors themselves seemed almost embarrassed to write down on paper. There were more clippings after that, spread thin across the decades, but never quite stopping altogether, each entry a little harder for her to track down than the one that had come directly before it. 2 hunters went missing near Black Kettle Lake in the winter of 1934 and were never found, despite what the article described as an extensive search effort mounted by the county that spring. A trapper's cabin was found empty and undisturbed except for a great deal of blood in the snow outside. In the winter of 1951, a detail the reporting officer apparently refused to elaborate on for the record. A pair of college students rented the lodge itself for a January retreat in 1978, and only one of them ever walked back out of the forest, 4 days later, alone, unable to give any coherent account of what had happened to his 3 friends. That surviving student was committed for psychiatric evaluation soon afterward, and according to the clipping's own final line, he never once spoke publicly about any part of that whole incident again. Running beneath all of it, clipped inside the folder's front cover in Ruth Ann's own neat handwriting, was a list of names she had compiled herself over years of collecting this material. 11 caretakers in total who had worked the Jernigan Trust property since the 1960s. Next to 3 of those names, in her careful hand, was written the single word missing, and next to Earl Kessler's name, the most recent entry on the whole list, there was nothing written at all, just a small question mark, which I found somehow worse than any of the words around it. Beyond that folder, once I had gone through every clipping in it twice, Ruth Ann brought out a second, thinner file she said she did not usually show to caretakers on their very first visit to her library. It held interviews she had conducted herself, decades earlier, as a much younger volunteer for the Historical Society, with elderly residents who had lived through some of the town's leaner, harder winters years before. Most of what she showed me was the kind of thing you would expect from oral history, fragmentary and contradictory, but 3 of the interviews, conducted separately and years apart, described the exact same detail. None of the 3 interviewees appeared to know about the existence of the other 2, which was the whole reason Ruth Ann had kept that particular file at all after so many years of collecting stories. All 3 described a winter sometime in the middle of the century, the exact year given differently in each account, when livestock began disappearing from farms nearest the tree line on the edge of town. Dogs would not settle at night during that same winter, and a family living closest to the forest packed up in the space of a single week and left the county for good without ever fully explaining why to any of their neighbors. One of them told a friend, in words the friend repeated decades later almost exactly the same way each of the 3 tellers remembered hearing it, that something had been calling their youngest boy's name from the woods for 4 straight nights. They were not going to wait around to find out what happened on the 5th night, the friend recalled being told, and Ruth Ann admitted she had never been able to substantiate the family's actual name or confirm the story through any official county record she could find. I found Ruth Ann again at the front desk and asked her, as evenly as I could manage, why the Jornigan Trust kept hiring caretakers to live on that property, if this was what happened to so many of them. She told me something I have not been able to stop thinking about since, which is that as far as she had ever been able to determine, nobody from the Jornican family had set foot on that property since sometime in the 1920s. The trust was administered entirely by attorneys, she said, and in her personal opinion, which she asked me specifically not to repeat to Warren Tolliver, the trust did not maintain the caretaker position simply because the lodge itself required maintaining. She would not elaborate further than that, no matter how I pressed her on it, and when I tried again, she only told me, kindly, but firmly, that I should talk to Elgin Whitefeather at the bait shop on the north end of Main Street before I did anything else at all. She said he would tell me more than she was willing to, because in her words he had earned the right to say it, and she, in all her years of collecting these stories, had not earned that same right yet. Elgin Whitefeather was a lean man I guessed to be somewhere in his 70s, running a small bait and tackle shop that in the month of November had almost no customers coming through the door at all. He did not seem surprised when I walked in and told him who I was and why Ruth Ann had sent me over from the library that same afternoon, and he simply set down the fishing reel he had been repairing. He told me to sit, and he talked to me for close to an hour straight, and I am going to tell you what he said as close to word for word as I can manage it, because I have gone over it many times since. He said that his grandmother's people had a name for what lived in the deep timber during hard winters, a spirit of hunger that could take hold of a man who had done what no man should ever have to do, to survive a starving season. Once it took hold, he said, the man was gone, and what wore his body afterward was not a man any longer, but the hunger itself, grown huge and gaunt and never once satisfied by anything it managed to take. He said it grew, that every person it consumed made it larger and hungrier both at the same time, which was the particular cruelty of it, that it could never eat its way to being full, only ever to being bigger and emptier at once. He said it could take the shape of your voice or something close enough to your voice to fool you in the dark, because it had likely taken a great many voices over more than a century in that stretch of woods. He said the single rule that mattered above every other rule he knew of was this, that it could not simply come and take you from inside walls you had properly sealed against it, not without some help from you. It needed you to come to it, he said, needed you to answer, needed you to open a door or step off a porch of your own free will, and every story he had heard of someone surviving an encounter began with that discipline. I asked him, because I had to ask someone eventually, why the trust kept sending men out there year after year despite everything he had just finished telling me about that particular property and its history. There was something harder underneath that pity, and he said he had wondered the same question himself for 40 years, and that the only answer he had ever arrived at was the only one that made the whole pattern make sense. He said that a thing like that, once it has truly taken hold of a piece of land the way it had taken hold of the ground around Black Kettle Lake, does not simply starve quietly if nobody ever comes at all. In the years the lodge had stood empty, before the trust started hiring caretakers at all, there had been a great deal more trouble in Lou Narrows itself. Cattle gone missing, and once, in a winter he did not want to describe, a family on the edge of town. He said he could not prove any of that particular connection outright, and he wanted to be clear with me that he could not prove it, but that he had noticed a pattern over the years that I should notice too. He said the trust seemed to strongly prefer hiring men who had told Warren Tolliver on that very first phone call that they had no family who would ever come looking for them if something went badly wrong. He asked me gently whether I had said something very much like that myself during my own first call with Tolliver, and I did not answer him directly because he could already see the answer plainly on my face. That was the first moment out of our whole long conversation that truly frightened me. More than the tracks, more than the bones, the voice that had called to me from the dark outside my door. It was the first moment I understood that I might not simply be an unlucky man who had taken a strange job at a bad time, alone and desperate enough for money to stop asking the right questions of anyone. I might instead be exactly the kind of man that particular job had been designed, over the course of many long decades, very deliberately to attract, to catch, and to keep quietly attracting for years. He gave me a small cloth pouch of coarse salt before I left the shop that afternoon, and told me to lay a line of it across every threshold in the lodge and the cabin both, doors and windows alike. without exception. He told me to keep a fire burning through the darkest hours of the night whenever I possibly could manage it, since he said fire held it back far more reliably than almost anything else he knew of at all. If I ever heard it call to me in a voice I truly loved, the kindest and safest thing I could possibly do for that person, wherever they actually were that particular night, was remember one simple fact. The real Renee, the real anyone at all, was never standing in the dark past my own tree line at 2 in the morning, and answering would not save them, because they had never truly been there to begin with. He told me a few other things that same afternoon that I did not fully appreciate until much later on, sitting alone in the dark with long hours left to fill and little else to do but turn his words over. He said that in the years he had spent gathering these stories from older relatives and from men who had worked timber and trapline in that country before him, a pattern had settled out that he trusted more than any single account taken on its own. He said it rarely showed itself fully to a person more than once or twice before that person's own story ended one way or the other. That it preferred patience and voices and the slow wearing down of a person's nerve to open confrontation, at least at first. He said the nights it finally did show itself close and plain were, in his long experience of these stories, the nights that mattered most. The nights a person's fate seemed to turn one direction or the other for good. I drove back to the lodge that afternoon with the light already failing fast, a pouch of salt sitting on the seat beside me, and for the first time since arriving at Cutfoot Lodge, I found myself doing the math. I counted how many miles of impassable road now stood between me and the nearest other human being, and I did not much care for the exact number I kept arriving at, no matter how carefully I ran it twice. I laid the salt that night exactly as Elgin Whitefeather had shown me, a careful line across the cabin's single door in both of its windows, and I built the wood stove up until the little cabin was almost too warm to bear comfortably. I sat up with Duke pressed against my leg and the lantern burning, and I did not hear my name called that particular night, not once, and I wanted to believe the salt had actually done something to earn that silence. I want to tell you that things got steadily better after that, because that is the kind of story I would prefer to be telling you now. But the trouble did not stop so much as it changed its shape entirely. The generator failed on a Thursday night in the 3rd week of November, and when I went out into the dark with a flashlight to see what had happened, I found the fuel line torn loose from its housing. It had not simply corroded or worked apart from years of ordinary vibration the way old fittings sometimes do. The metal itself was bent outward in a way that took real strength to accomplish by hand. There were those same prints again in the thin crust of snow around the machine shed, circling it twice before finally heading off toward the tree line, each stride noticeably longer than the one before it. I spent 2 cold days repairing the fuel line with parts I had to fabricate myself in the machine shed, running on battery lanterns in the wood stove alone since the generator was still down entirely. It was on the second of those nights that Duke went missing, after I had let him out to do his business as I did every night before bed, turning back inside for no more than 3 or 4 minutes to bank the fire properly. When I opened the door again to call him back in, he was simply gone. No bark, no sound of any struggle at all, nothing but silence where a dog had been standing 30 seconds earlier that same evening. I went out into the dark, calling his name, which I understand now was close to the worst thing I could possibly have done that night, though panic did not leave much room for Elgin Whitefeather's rules. I searched the tree line with a flashlight for the better part of an hour, finding nothing at all, no tracks, no sign of him anywhere, until finally close to the machine shed I found him lying there. What was left of him did not look like it had been killed by any animal I had ever heard of in my life, and I'm not going to describe it beyond saying that I finally understood, looking at it, exactly how a deer comes to be opened from throat to tail in one single motion. I understood for the first time with my whole body and not just my mind, that whatever lived in the trees around Cutfoot Lodge had, over the preceding 6 weeks, been deciding something about me, weighing something. The way you might watch a fire slowly build before finally deciding it was worth the risk of stepping close enough to warm your hands against it. That was the closest comparison I could find for what I felt that night. I want to describe one more thing about that particular night before moving on, because I think it explains the exact shape of my fear over the weeks that followed far better than anything else could. After I found what was left of Duke, I did not go back into the cabin right away, and I stood there in the flashlight beam for a long time, long enough that the cold started working its way through my boots. Somewhere behind me, from the direction of the birches where the ravens had been gathering every dusk for weeks, I heard something that took me a moment to recognize, because it was so unlike anything else it had done up to that point. It was not my name, and it was not Renee's voice, or my mother's. It was a low, patient sound very close to a chuckle. 2 or 3 notes only, rising and falling the way a man laughs quietly over something only he finds funny. I understood, standing there over my dog's body with that sound behind me in the dark, that I had been wrong to think of it only as hungry, because whatever wore that sound also seemed, in some way I did not want to examine too closely, to be enjoying itself. That realization frightened me in a way the hunger alone had never quite managed to. Because hunger I could at least imagine reasoning with eventually, and amusement I found I could not reason with at all. I buried what I could of Duke the next morning in ground so cold it took me 3 long hours with a pick and a shovel just to break through the frozen crust, and afterward I sat quietly with the radio. I seriously considered for the first time since arriving simply walking out 2 miles down the plow road to where it met the county road, and from there some 40 more miles into Loon Narrows on foot. The snow was already knee-deep in places by then, and getting steadily deeper by the week, according to the forecast I kept catching on the radio, which made the whole idea sound worse the longer I sat with it. I did not walk out that day, and I have asked myself many times since why not. And the honest answer is some combination of stubbornness about the money still coming to me, and plain shock that made staying feel easier than leaving. Underneath both of those was something I am less proud of. A thin thread of disbelief that told me, even after everything I had already seen, that surely nothing this bad could actually be happening to a man as ordinary as me. I have come to understand since then that this particular kind of disbelief, the kind that keeps you standing a moment too long in a doorway, might be one of the things it counts on most of all in the end. This storm came in on the last night of November, a real blizzard, the exact kind the radio had been warning about for 2 full days straight, and I want to tell you about it as carefully as I possibly can. It was the night everything that had been building for 8 long weeks finally arrived at my very door, instead of merely circling somewhere out at the edge of the trees the way it had done before then. The wind started around 4 in the afternoon, and by 7 it had built into something that made the whole cabin groan on its foundation. Snow coming sideways so thick that my flashlight beam simply vanished 6 feet from my hand into a wall of white. I had the salt line fresh across every threshold, and I had, for the first time since Duke died, locked the cabin door with the old iron bolt Earl Kessler had apparently installed at some point during his own tenure there. I had noticed that bolt on my first week and dismissed it as strange over-engineering for a door that led, as far as I knew then, to nothing more dangerous than deer and the occasional wandering raccoon. I sat that night with the lantern turned low to save fuel, listening to the wind howl outside, and it was somewhere close to 10 o'clock when I first heard the sound against the north wall of the cabin. It was a sound less like knocking and more like something testing the logs themselves, a slow and deliberate pressure moving along the wall from one corner toward the window, pausing every few feet as though counting the gaps between the boards. I did not move from my chair, and I want that on record because in the version of this story I used to tell myself afterward, I like to think I handled that particular night with some kind of courage. The truth is closer to the opposite, that I sat there frozen with a fireplace poker in one hand, and did not trust my own legs to carry me anywhere at all that night, not even across the small dark room. The pressure against the wall reached the window, and I watched, because I could not make myself look away, as the salt on the sill trembled and shifted very slightly, the way sand shifts when something enormous passes close by without touching it. For just a moment, between one gust of wind and the next, the noise outside stopped entirely, and into that stillness came a voice, close enough now that it seemed to originate from directly outside the glass itself. It said my name, not Cole, not even Cole Andrew this time, but a small diminutive that nobody but my own mother had ever used, a name I had not heard spoken aloud in the 6 years since her own funeral. It was said in a voice that had the particular warmth and rasp of her own voice exactly as I remembered it, worn thin now as though I were hearing it through a heavy wall of moving water somewhere close by. Aggiato Split Point, Part 2 begins brave. I have relived that particular moment more times than any other single moment of my entire life, including my own wedding day, including the terrible morning Renee finally told me she was leaving me for good. What I remember most clearly is not fear in the way I would have described fear beforehand, some sharp animal thing that makes a person run for the nearest exit without thinking, but something slower and far worse, a kind of pull. It was a longing so specific and so precisely aimed at the exact soft center of me that for 3 or 4 full seconds I was on my feet and moving toward that door before any conscious part of my mind caught up with what my body was already doing. I do not know, to this day, what stopped me from opening it, and I would like to say it was Elgin Whitefeather's warning repeating itself in my head at the very last possible second, and maybe it partly was. I think just as much of it was some older and more stubborn part of me that recognized, even through the ache of missing my mother, that the cadence of the voice was wrong somehow, stretched a half-second too long between each word. It sounded like a recording slowed down slightly by someone who did not fully understand the rhythm of the thing they were trying so carefully to imitate that particular night against the roaring storm. I stopped with my hand actually resting on the iron bowl, and I stood there shaking while the voice called my mother's diminutive for me 3 more times, each one a little more insistent than the last. Then, all at once, the pressure against the wall resumed, moving away from the window and around toward the porch, and I heard over the wind the boards on the porch groaning under a weight I did not want to picture. It was weight distributed across a stride far longer than any human foot could ever cover in a single step. And I did not sleep at all that night, sitting with my back against the wall farthest from any window in the whole cabin. I listened to something enormous circle the cabin 3 separate times over the course of that night, testing the salt at every threshold and finding, each time, some reason to move on rather than actually cross it. Between the second and third circuit there was a long stretch, close to an hour by my best guess, when the sound stopped entirely and the only thing I could hear was the wind working itself back up again outside the walls. I remember that hour as somehow harder to sit through than the ones with the pressure against the walls, because the silence left room for my own mind to fill in what might be happening just beyond the logs. When the third circuit began, close to 3 in the morning by the clock on the mantel, it did something it had not done in the first 2 passes, pausing at the door itself for longer than it had paused anywhere else that night. I heard, low and almost gentle against the wood, 3 slow taps, evenly spaced apart, followed by nothing at all for the better part of a full minute afterward, which somehow felt worse than any noise. I have never in my life wanted so badly to simply stand up and answer a knock at my own front door as I wanted to in that particular minute, sitting alone in the dark with my fire already burning low. Some worn down, exhausted part of me argued that anything at all, even the worst thing I could possibly imagine, might be better than 1 more hour spent not knowing what stood on the other side of that wood. I did not stand up, and the taps did not ever come again after that. And sometime around 4 in the morning, the sounds finally stopped entirely, and the wind outside began, at long last, to slowly ease. I understood, by the gray light that eventually found its way through the shutters, that I had survived Knight Earl Kessler, for all his iron bolts and whatever else he had known that I did not yet know, apparently had not survived in that same cabin 6 weeks before me. The next morning, in the exhausted, adrenaline-scraped clarity that follows a night like that one, I did the only sensible thing I could think of, which was to get on the radio the moment my window opened. I told the dispatcher in Loon Narrows that I needed a welfare check, that something had come around the property overnight and killed my dog, and that I did not feel safe staying out here alone anymore. I did not use the word I was already privately starting to think to myself by then, because I understood all too well exactly how it would sound spoken aloud into a county radio on an ordinary morning. What I got back, after a delay that felt much longer than it probably actually was word that a deputy named Marv Ostrander would drive out on his snowmobile that same afternoon to come check on me. He would come once the plow crews had a chance to clear the county road partway, and that I should sit tight and keep my doors locked in the meantime. Advice that struck me as both obvious and completely useless. Deputy Ostrander arrived a little after 2 in the afternoon. a broad and unhurried man in his 50s who clearly suspected, before he had even shut off his snowmobile, that this call was going to be more of the same. Nothing. I walked him around the property in the last of the daylight, showing him the torn fuel line, the prints circling the machine shed, and the disturbed ground where I had buried Duke just the day before. His professional skepticism thinned out very slightly with every single stop we made together that afternoon, though he never once said so out loud to me during our whole walk around that quiet property. It was when we came around to the woodshed at the far edge of my usual rounds that he stopped walking entirely and stood very still and told me something in a voice that had gone quieter than anything he had said all afternoon. He wanted me to go back inside and radio in his exact location to dispatch while he checked something behind the shed himself, and when I asked what exactly he had seen, he did not answer me directly. He told me again, more firmly this time, to simply go back inside, and something in his face, some flicker of the same recognition I imagine had crossed my own face a dozen times, made me do exactly as he said. I was inside no more than 90 seconds, working the radio dial, when I heard him call out from behind the shed. Not a scream, exactly. Nothing so clean as a scream, but a short, sharp sound cut off in the middle. Then there was nothing at all after that sound, and I went straight to the window, rather than the door, which I believe now is the only real reason I am able to tell you any of this particular story today. Through the gap in the shutter, I watched the light fail fast the way it always does. That far north in early winter, and I did not see Deputy Ostrander ever come back around the corner of that woodshed. What I saw, perhaps 20 minutes later, once full dark had come down completely, was his hat, sitting upright and undisturbed in a patch of snow roughly 40 feet from where I had last seen him standing. There was also a long dragging smear leading from that spot back toward the tree line, dark enough against the white snow that I did not need any better light to understand exactly what it was made of. I did not go out to check on him, and I want to be honest that this particular decision, which I still believe was the correct one, has not stopped me from feeling like a coward every time I think about it. I bolted the cabin door, and I built the fire up as high as I could safely manage that night, and somewhere close to 9 o'clock, I heard Deputy Ostrander's voice, calm and perfectly ordinary, calling out. It sounded exactly the way he had sounded discussing the weather on our drive-in earlier, calling now from somewhere near the woodshed that he was hurt and badly needed help getting back to the cabin. He said he could not walk on his own and that he needed me to come out with the truck, and it went on for the better part of an hour, patient in a way that frightened me more than anything else that whole night. It never once rose to a scream, never varied much in tone at all, simply repeating some version of the same calm, reasonable request over and over, from a spot that never seemed to move any closer to the door. I sat with my hands pressed over my ears at points during that hour, and I did not answer him. And I did not open that door, and eventually, sometime after midnight, the voice finally stopped altogether. The silence that followed it was worse, somehow, than the voice itself had been all night, because it left me with nothing to listen to except the specific, terrible knowledge that I was now completely alone. I had no dog left anymore, no deputy, no working generator I fully trusted, and a road out that even the plow truck could not manage in the deep drifts that storm had left behind everywhere on the property. I want to tell you that I made a plan that night, some clear-headed strategy born entirely of desperation, but the truth is I mostly sat awake doing arithmetic that would not resolve into anything useful at all. 62 miles to town on roads that were not currently passable, a radio that had brought help directly into whatever this was, rather than away from it, and a truck battery already dead from the cold. I had not had the composure to check that battery until well past dark that evening, and somewhere in the small hours of that arithmetic, exhausted past the point where fear could keep me sharp, I finally remembered something. Elgin Whitefeather had mentioned it almost as an aside, near the end of our long conversation in the bait shop. Something about an original hunting cabin the Jernigan family had built long before the main lodge itself. He believed it still stood somewhere out on the property, closer to the old logging campsite, and I remembered that Tolliver's own paperwork had made a strange, glancing reference to some secondary structure. That paperwork had specifically said it was not for tenant use, and I understood, with the particular clarity that comes only at 4 in the morning, after surviving a night like the one I had just lived through. If there were any answers left on that property beyond what Ruth Ann's folder and Elgin Whitefeather's warnings had already given me, That hidden structure was almost certainly where I was going to find them at last. I no longer had the luxury of being afraid to go looking for it now, whatever it turned out to actually be. Once I finally found my own way out there through all that fresh, deep snow the storm had left behind. I waited for first light before I left the cabin at all that morning, because whatever discipline I had left in me was not enough to send me out into the dark again. After that night, I had barely survived. I want to say that the daylight made things better, but honestly, it mostly just made things visible, and the frozen smear behind the woodshed was not something I looked at any longer than I strictly had to that morning. I loaded a backpack with what supplies I could carry, a hatchet, a flashlight with fresh batteries, the remainder of Elgin Whitefeather salt, and Ruth Ann's photocopied folder, which I had kept in the cabin without ever quite deciding to bring it there. I set out on a pair of snowshoes I found in the machine shed, following the rough line Elgin had described to me, north and slightly east of the lodge, deeper into the trees than I had let myself go in the 2 months I had already spent at Black Kettle Lake. It took me close to 3 hours of hard walking through fresh, waist-deep snow to find it, a structure so overgrown and sunken into the forest floor that I passed within 30 feet of it twice before I recognized the shape of a roofline under all that snow. It was small, a single room built of logs gone black and soft with a full century of weather, and the door had long since rotted off its hinges entirely, leaving an opening the forest had partly reclaimed with young spruce growing straight up through what had once been a threshold. I want to tell you, I hesitated before going inside, and I did, for a long moment, standing in snow that had drifted nearly to my knees right at the doorway. But I had already come too far to turn back now. I searched through the heap of collapsed shelving for the better part of an hour with cold, numb hands and a dim flashlight beam that kept catching on nothing but old mouse nests and patches of mildew. I was close to giving up entirely when I found, wrapped in what had once been an oilcloth and protected just enough by that wrapping to have survived a full century, 2 separate things worth reading. The first was a thin, leather-bound ledger, water-damaged along its edges but still legible in the center of most pages, filled with a small, careful hand that I did not recognize at all that morning. The second, tucked inside the ledger's own back cover, was a spiral notebook, cheap and clearly far more modern by comparison, water-damaged much less severely than the older ledger wrapped around it. I understood within the very first few lines of it that this second notebook actually belonged to Earl Kessler himself, and I sat right down on that cabin's frozen floor to read through every page of both. I am going to tell you what those 2 documents said, because I think it is the only way for you to understand what I came to understand, sitting on that frozen cabin floor with the light going gray outside. The ledger was much older, and though it was not signed anywhere at all that I could find inside its pages, the details it contained left very little doubt about who had originally written or dictated it. It had almost certainly been written by someone close to Ezra Jornigan himself, possibly a nephew or a junior partner in the timber concern who had inherited both the land and, I came to believe, some fuller version of the truth. That fuller version went well beyond what the newspapers of 1902 had ever been permitted to print for the general public back then, and it named the old thing plainly where the papers had not. The ledger described the blizzard of that particular winter in careful, patient detail. 3 full weeks of storm so severe that the camp had been entirely unable to send word out for help of any kind. It described supplies running out much faster than anyone at that camp had ever planned for, and it described, in language the writer seemed to struggle committing to paper, Jernigan's own confession. That confession, the ledger said, had been given during a period of apparent lucidity, sometime before his final and irreversible decline into the full madness that would later carry him to the asylum. Jernigan claimed that as the camp's food ran out and men began dying of exposure and starvation both, he had made a choice that he could not later undo, no matter how badly he came to wish otherwise. He believed that in making that choice, something had entered him, or entered the ground around the camp through him, something the ledger's author only ever called the Old Hunger, careful never to use any other name for it at all. Jernigan believed, and the ledger recorded this belief without either confirming or dismissing it outright, that this hunger did not simply pass through a man and leave him afterward the way a fever might. He believed instead that it took root permanently, that it grew with every additional life it consumed, and that it could never be fully rid of a place once it had already been fed there. only ever managed. It could only ever be kept fed enough and kept far enough away from other living people that it never went looking for its own meals in town instead of out in the deep timber where it truly belonged. There was one passage in the middle of the ledger that I have thought about more than any other since, in which the author, describing Jernigan's confession as related to him secondhand, wrote something striking. Jernigan had insisted the thing he became beholden to during that particular hard winter did not think of itself as a monster in any sense the word would ordinarily carry to an outside observer at all. He experienced what he did, Jernigan claimed, the way a starving man experiences the last desperate act of a shipwreck without any real cruelty in it, simply without any capacity left inside him for anything else at all. The author noted, with what struck me as genuine discomfort even filtered through a full century of careful old-fashioned handwriting on the page, that Jernigan wept through much of this particular telling. Whatever remained of the man underneath the hunger seemed to understand precisely what he had done and precisely what he had become, and he grieved both, even as some larger and colder part of him had already stopped being capable of choosing differently by then. I do not know what to do with that particular passage even now. All these long months later, sitting somewhere warm and relatively safe with almost nothing left of that whole winter except my own memory of it. The ledger's later pages describe the family's decision, made sometime in the 1920s as the timber business wound down and the land itself passed into what would eventually become the trust. They resolved to maintain a presence on the property indefinitely and to ensure, in the ledger's own careful phrasing, that the old hunger was never left wanting for long enough to wander far from home. I read that particular sentence perhaps 6 times before I let myself fully understand it, sitting in that cold cabin with my own breath fogging in front of the flashlight beam I was holding steady with both hands. What I understood was this: that the position I had answered a hardware store bulletin board for in September was not a caretaker position in any sense I had believed it to be when I signed Tolliver's contract. It was bait, and it had always been bait, dressed up in $22,000 and a warm cabin and careful legal language about no family who would come looking, offered again and again over the decades to men in exactly my situation. Near the very back of the ledger, written in a hand that had grown noticeably shakier than the rest of the entries, as though set down much later by the same careful author after age had taken its toll. There was something there closer to a list than the flowing paragraphs that filled the rest of the pages, headed only with the words for whoever comes after, plain and unadorned at the very top of the page. It set out, plainly and without any embellishment at all, what the author had personally come to believe were the safest working assumptions for managing the whole arrangement over the long term of years. It never crosses open, cleared ground toward a lit structure if it can possibly be avoided at all, and it prefers instead to work carefully along tree lines in moving shadow throughout its entire approach. It cannot mimic a voice it has never actually heard before, which meant, the author noted with what struck me as a small, cold mercy, that it could not yet know the sound of my own children. Should I ever have any, unless I spoke of them aloud within its hearing? It answers hunger with hunger, taking more readily and more aggressively in the weeks immediately following a kill than in the weeks leading up to one, which meant Ostrander's death had likely left it, for some period afterward, less patient rather than more so. And last, underlined twice in ink that had gone brown with age, it does not forget a scent it has taken an interest in, not across a single season, and, the author believed, not across a lifetime either. I did not want to believe that particular line when I first read it sitting alone in that cabin, and I have since found very little real reason to doubt it, no matter how badly I have wanted to over these last months. Earl Kessler's notebook confirmed the rest of it in language far less careful than the old ledgers. The words of a frightened, exhausted man writing quickly by lantern light in what were, I came to believe, his final days before he finally ran for it. He had found the same cabin I was sitting in, apparently in his own 7th or 8th week on the property, and had read the same ledger, and his entries after that point traced an arc I recognized with a kind of sick familiarity. It was the same arc my own 2 months had traced, the voices calling his name, a sister's voice in his case rather than a mother's, Prince circling closer, and a neighbor's dog he had been asked to board for the season, killed the very same way Duke had been killed, near the end in handwriting that had grown ragged and pressed hard enough into the paper to actually tear it in places, was a single entry I have not been able to stop thinking about since I read it. He wrote that he had finally understood why every caretaker before him seemed to last roughly one season and no more. That it was not simple coincidence, and not just the isolation slowly wearing a man down over time. The thing in the woods had a rhythm to it, he wrote. The same way a trapline has a rhythm, checked and reset at regular intervals, and he did not intend to be the check it collected on this particular round of the cycle. His final entry said only that he was leaving that night on foot, following the frozen course of a creek he believed would bring him out somewhere near the county road before dawn broke over the tree line. He wrote that if anyone ever found this notebook, they should know he had not simply abandoned the job out of laziness or fear. He had run for his own life and did not know, writing those exact words, whether he was actually going to make it out alive. I sat with that notebook for a long time after I finished reading it, long enough that the light outside the ruined cabin's window had gone from gray to nearly black by the time I finally looked up again. I understood two things with equal certainty in that darkening room, sitting there with the cold pressing in from every direction and my flashlight battery already showing its first flicker of weakness. The first was that Earl Kessler had, in fact, made it out alive, because Tolliver's paperwork had described him as having quit the position, not as having gone missing like the others on Ruth Ann's list. That meant somewhere out there was a man who already knew exactly what I now knew myself, and who had simply let the trust hire me straight into that very same trap without one single word of warning. That particular fact filled me with an anger I did not have room to feel fully until much later, once I was somewhere safe enough to actually sit with it properly instead of just surviving 1 hour at a time. The second thing I understood, sitting there with the temperature steadily dropping, was that I needed to be moving right then, that very night, before the next storm came in and sealed the roads for good behind it. His own notebook was frustratingly vague about the exact path he had actually taken that night, the words of a man writing quickly for his own private reference rather than for someone else to follow. I was able to piece together enough, cross-referenced against a rough hand-drawn map folded into the back pages, that a frozen creek he called Widow Creek ran from a point roughly half a mile north of the old cabin down toward the county road. It joined the road near a culvert some 11 or 12 miles east of the lodge's main gate, which was considerably closer than backtracking the full length of the plow road would have been that night. It was full dark by the time I finally set out, guided by a flashlight I was already rationing carefully, and a memory of the map I had studied for maybe 10 minutes before the cold in that cabin became unbearable. I want to tell you plainly that I do not fully remember every part of the walk that followed, because somewhere in the second or third hour of it, exhaustion and cold and fear folded together into something that made time itself behave strangely. Some minutes stretched out to what felt like whole hours, and other minutes compressed down to almost nothing at all. And I have never fully trusted my own memory of that particular night since it happened. I heard it moving behind me twice during that very first hour of walking, that same testing, deliberate sound out in the trees off to my left, never quite closing the full distance between us that night. I did not run because Earl Kessler's notebook, in one of its last coherent entries, had included a line I clung to for the rest of that long night. That running seemed only to draw its attention faster than walking did. I do not know if that was actually true, or simply the private belief of one desperate man that happened to keep him alive long enough to write it down for whoever eventually came after him at the lodge. I held to that steady pace for as long as my legs would allow it, following the black ribbon of the frozen creek bed under a sky gone perfectly clear and hard with cold once the earlier storm had blown itself out. There were more stars overhead that night than I had ever seen in my entire life, which struck me, even in the middle of everything else happening around me, as a strange and almost cruel kind of beauty to witness. It called to me twice more before that night was through, and I am going to describe both of those times because I think they matter to understanding how close I came to not finishing this story at all. The first time, perhaps 2 hours into the walk, it used Renee's voice, calling from somewhere off to my right, closer to the creek itself than I was comfortable with, saying my name in the tone of genuine, aching worry, aching worry. I recognized that tone from the early years of our marriage before things went wrong between us, and it took everything I had left in me not to answer, not because I believed it was truly her. My mind understood the rules well enough by that point in the night. Some older and more stubborn part of me simply wanted, with a longing that had nothing rational left in it, for it to actually be her. For someone somewhere to actually be worried about whether I made it home alive. I kept walking through all of it anyway, and I did not look toward the voice at all, no matter how badly some old married part of me still wanted to turn my head and simply look. Just once toward her. The second time it happened, closer to what I judged to be 4 in the morning by then. Exhaustion had worn me down enough that the voice did not even need to be someone I loved to very nearly work on me. It used my own voice this time, my own exact words, calling out from somewhere ahead of me along the creek bed that I was lost, that I had wandered off the safe path, and that I should simply stop and wait for it to come find me. I understood, hearing myself speak from a throat that was clearly not my own, exactly how large and how close it must have already grown to manage a mimicry that precise and that convincing in the dark. That particular understanding, more than anything else that whole night, was what finally put something like real, focused terror back into my legs and kept me moving forward without ever stopping again. Somewhere past the midpoint of that whole walk, close to where Kessler's rough map showed the creek bending hard around a beaver dam before straightening out again toward the culvert, I finally saw it clearly. I had stopped for perhaps 30 seconds to catch my breath at the top of the bank, flashlight off to save the last of the battery, and in the clear starlight I saw it standing on the far side of the dam, perhaps 60 yards off. It stood among the black shapes of the frozen alder, the way a man might stand at the edge of a room deciding whether or not to actually enter it, not moving at all, simply watching me quietly there in the dark. It was tall past any reasonable measure I could make sense of that particular night, easily twice my own height, and gaunt in a way that made the height itself feel wrong rather than merely impressive. Ribs and the long bones of its limbs pressed up under skin gone the gray-white of old birch bark, and above its narrow skull something caught the starlight in jagged, branching points. Whether antler or simply wild bone, I never had the nerve to decide. It did not move toward me at all that particular night, and it did not call out in anyone's voice that time. It simply stood there watching me quietly, and I stood frozen at the top of that snowy bank. I understood, in that long, frozen half a minute of standing there, that it was choosing, in no particular hurry at all, whether the distance between us was actually worth closing that particular night. It was weighing me the same unhurried way I imagined it had once weighed Duke, and weighed Deputy Ostrander, and weighed however many other men whose names filled Ruth Ann Sorensen's list before mine. I do not know what tipped that particular choice in my favor that night, and I've wondered since whether it was simply already fed enough for that week, or whether something else was at work entirely. I have wondered whether some small scrap of whatever man it had once been generations before recognized something in the careful, unhurried pace Kessler's notebook had taught me to walk with that night. I only know that after that long half-minute it finally turned away, unfolding itself back into the dark alders, with a total silence that a shape that size should never have truly been capable of managing. It kept me walking until the black shape of the creek bed finally widened out ahead of me into what I recognized, with a relief I still do not have adequate words for even now, as the concrete mouth of a culvert. I came up finally out of that frozen creek bed onto plowed asphalt sometime close to dawn, half frozen and bleeding from a deep cut across one cheek I did not even remember getting during the entire walk. I walked the county road for close to 2 more hours after that before the first vehicle of the morning, a Loon Narrow school bus running its rural route early, finally found me stumbling along the shoulder and stopped. I will not spend long telling you about the days immediately following. The hospital in town for frostbite on 3 of my toes. The sheriff's department taking a careful statement about Deputy Ostrander that I gave in edited pieces. I understood, even in my sheer exhaustion, that particular morning, that the full truth would get me committed somewhere rather than actually believed by anyone in that sheriff's office that afternoon. A search team went out to the property 2 full days later, once the roads were finally cleared enough to allow it through, and they returned a single afternoon later having found almost nothing at all. According to the young officer who told me about it in the hospital hallway, they found only Deputy Ostrander's snowmobile parked exactly where he had left it, and a hat that the family was eventually given for a funeral that had no body inside the casket at all. I watched that officer choose his next words very carefully before he told me the search had been officially suspended pending further evidence, in the flat tone of a man who understood something else entirely. He understood, without being able to say so on any official record, that no further evidence was likely to turn up no matter how many more times they sent a team back into that particular stretch of timber. The conversation with Warren Tolliver's own office finally came a few days later, over the phone this time around, since I refused outright to ever set foot back inside his office building again for anything. I want to tell you that I said everything I had rehearsed saying to him on the long drive south. That I laid out Elgin Whitefeather's warnings and the ledger's careful, damning language about ensuring the old hunger was never left wanting for long. I gave him Ruth Ann's whole list of names with all those small question marks beside them too. All of it, in a voice that started out fairly controlled and did not manage to stay that way for very long. Tolliver listened to the entire thing without interrupting me even once, which I have come to believe was its own kind of answer in itself. A long silence that told me far more than words might have that day. When I finally ran out of things to say, he stayed quiet on the line for a long moment before telling me, in that same clipped formal register he had used since our very first call back in September. He said the position's final payment would still be honored in full given the exact circumstances, and that the trust sincerely wished me well in whatever I chose to do next with the entirety of my life. I asked him directly, before he could hang up the phone on me first that day, whether Earl Kessler had told him any of what I had just told him, back when he quit so suddenly in September without warning. There was a pause on the line just slightly too long to be nothing at all, before Tolliver finally said only that the trust did not discuss the specifics of prior employees' departures with anyone at all. The line went dead after that, and I understood clearly enough that I was not going to get anything further out of him that day. Not then, and not ever, no matter how many more times I bothered to call. I finally left Loon Narrows for good 4 whole days after that school bus found me out on the county road, and I drove south with the heat in my truck turned up as high as it would go all the way home. I did not look in the rearview mirror more than I could help along that entire long drive south, and before leaving town for good, I made one final stop at the bait shop on the north end of Main Street. I found Elgin Whitefeather closing up his shop for the evening, and I told him, standing right there in his doorway with the cold coming in behind me, everything the old ledger and notebook had taught me. He did not look surprised by any of it at all, which told me he had likely already worked out the shape of that same answer himself, over his 40 long years of collecting these very particular stories. He did not offer me any comfort about it either, which I found, oddly enough, far easier to accept than real comfort would have been from him. Standing there quietly in that small shop that late evening, he told me only that I should not blame myself too harshly for having answered that hardware store card back in September. That men in my exact situation had been answering cards very much like it for as long as the trust had existed to post them. He said the cruelty of the whole arrangement belonged only to whoever had built it and quietly maintained it across those many generations, not to the tired, broke, unlucky men it was designed to catch. I have held on to that particular thought the way you hold on to anything a kind stranger tells you on the worst week of your entire life. Not because it fixes anything at all, but because it is something solid to hold on to. I want to end this whole story right there, with a man who made it out alive, because that is the ending I would have chosen for myself, if anyone had actually thought to ask me that particular cold morning. But I told you at the very beginning that I do not think a story quite like this one ever ends cleanly, and I have to be honest with you now, in this last part of it, about exactly why that is so true. I have been back living quietly in Duluth for quite a good while now, in a different apartment than the one I had before, one that at least does not smell like birds the way that old place always used to. By most measures, a person looking at my whole life from the outside would probably say I got out, and I got lucky, and that I should simply be grateful and move on with life the way ordinary people do. I've tried to do exactly that, and I found steady work again eventually. Not at a plant this time, but doing maintenance for a property management company. Hours regular enough that I do not think much about money anymore. On paper, my life now looks close enough to ordinary that most people who meet me these days would never once guess at any part of what I have just spent this entire time telling you tonight right now. I have tried more than once to tell someone the full truth of it, a coworker over a beer after a long shift, a woman I dated briefly in the spring who ended things not long after I finally made the attempt to explain myself to her. I have learned every single time I have tried that there is no way to say any of this out loud to a person who was not actually standing right there in that cabin with me that night, that did not sound off. It sounded, every single time I finally said it out loud, like exactly the kind of thing a man says right before people around him start gently suggesting he should go talk to somebody professional soon. So I have mostly stopped trying to tell it at all after that point, until tonight. And I am not entirely sure why tonight feels so different from all those other times I have considered telling someone. Except that the wanting behind my own ribs has been noticeably worse this particular week than it has been in a long while now. And some part of me thought that saying it all the way through might help. There are nights, more of them lately than there used to be, when I wake up at some small hour with a hunger inside me that food does not seem to touch. No matter how much of it I eat right away then. It is a gnawing, restless want that sits underneath my ribs and does not have a name I'm willing to write down here. Even now, even after everything I've already told you tonight about that whole winter. On those particular nights, I find myself standing at my own kitchen window looking out at the dark parking lot behind my building, and more than once now I have heard, very faintly, something on the wind. It might be a voice, and it might be nothing at all, carried on wind that has no real business making a sound like that in the middle of a city, calling out a name that used to belong only to my mother. I have not answered it, and I want that fact on the record here too, but I no longer sleep with the lights off, and I no longer trust the particular quality of silence that settles into a room at 4 in the morning. Last week, though, I came closer than I have at any point since driving south out of Lou Narrows, standing at that same kitchen window at close to 3 in the morning with the glass cold against my forehead. I stood there long enough that my downstairs neighbor later told me she had heard my floor creaking back and forth for the better part of an hour, and had almost called the building manager to check on me directly. I do not have a tidy explanation for why the pull seems to be getting stronger rather than weaker with distance and time, when every instinct I had before all of this would have told me the opposite should be true by now. I have started to wonder, in my worst moments, whether Elgin Whitefeather's old rule about it never forgetting a scent it has taken an interest in was not only a warning about that property, but about something it carries with it into whoever walks away still hungry. Some weeks ago, without quite deciding to, I found myself back on that same hardware store's website, scrolling through a page of seasonal job postings that I had no real reason to be looking at all. Near the bottom of the list, newly posted, was a card that read almost word for word, like the one that started all of this back in September, seeking a winter caretaker for 7 months, $22,000, housing and a truck provided. It asked, exactly the way it had once asked me, whether the applicant had any family at all who would need to visit during the winter months. A question I now understand was never truly about visiting. I closed that particular browser tab right then, and I want you to know for certain that I did in fact close it, that I did not fill out even one single field of that whole form, no matter how long I sat there. But I have not been able to stop myself, in the week since that night, from wondering who was reading that exact same posting right now, somewhere else, in some other kitchen, at some other small hour. I find myself hoping in whatever strange way a man in my particular condition is still capable of hoping for anyone besides himself, that whoever answers that card this time reads it more carefully than I ever did. I hope they ask, before they sign a single page of that contract, exactly what kind of caretaking a job like that is actually asking of them. Out there on the shore of that black, silent lake, 62 miles from anyone who might come looking,